I did a version of this talk back in August for the Brown Bag series, and hopefully I have a couple of new tidbits in here, just a little bit, but a lot of these are my favorite stories about cemeteries that I've explored around the area. So if you didn't come to that talk in August, there'll be a lot of really interesting, kind of morbid things for you guys to learn about tonight, which is the theme of this whole series, I'm understanding. So you guys have that to look forward to. A couple of things you guys should know about me just before I get started talking about actual grave sites I found. So one, I used to be a journalist, so that is kind of the background for a lot of this stuff. I'm very into research and just like hard facts and stats and just stories like that. So a lot of that is through the Colorado Historic newspapers that I've done a lot of this research because I'm just super nerdy about journalism and love old newspaper stories. So that's one thing. One other disclaimer I have is that I wouldn't consider myself an expert about any of the cemeteries around here, about cemeteries in general and grave sites. I just do it as a hobby. I'm definitely an amateur. I just learned some things because I like learning about them, so don't consider me, an expert, end-all, be-all kind of thing about these stories. As you'll see, a lot of them do have discrepancies and weird information that I also just don't know what's right and what's wrong, so just keep that in mind as you're hearing this stuff. And then lastly, and probably most important, like I said, this is a combination of sort of my journalistic research and background, and then just history in general, of course, along with my photography of cemeteries I visited in Routt County. I don't know if you guys have read old newspapers before, but they are very different than the way that newspapers are written nowadays. So a lot of the stories here are quite graphic. There's a lot of stuff about murder and violence and bloodshed and gunfire and all of that good old Wild West stuff. So I know you guys are probably here for all that stuff, but if it makes you uncomfortable, I won't be offended if you have to take a little break, because it is very just old-timey Wild West newspaper stories. And that is the best part about this stuff, is that that's how it was written, that's how it was lived. All that Wild West history is the stuff that is super interesting to me. So I won't be offended if you guys need to take a little break from some of the violence that's in here. All right. So before I get into the actual stories of what I've found out, a little background about how I got into cemetery exploration. I grew up in semi-rural Michigan, kind of right in the middle of suburbia and rural county roads and everything. And I used to go and ride my bike around the cemeteries. There was one that was like a 1.5 or 2 miles away from my house, and I used to go and like have lunch there and read, and people thought that was very strange and probably still do. But I would go there and hang out, and I would ride my bike around to all the grid cemeteries around churches in my area, and it was super fun just to go and take a little bike ride and get some exercise and see some gravestones. And now, whenever I travel, whenever I go to a new town, I always try to visit the cemetery, even if I don't know anything about the town. It's just a really cool place to go wander around because it tells you so much about that town. I'm sure you guys have been in places where there's a lot of the same names that are kind of broadcast on buildings and on street signs and that kind of thing. And you can find out those people in the cemetery without knowing anything about them. If there's someone who's famous in that town, of course you can go and see, maybe they have their whole family that was buried there. And the cemetery is a really cool way to go wander through that and see that history without needing to go read a book, and you can just go see this beautiful landscape that someone's cared for. So whenever I visit a new town, I always try to do that and stop by the cemetery, and that's what I did when I moved here. I've lived in Steamboat for about 7.5 years, and when I moved out here, I was definitely more familiar with the town cemetery. So I've lived in both Steamboat and Hayden, so those two cemeteries are where I've explored the most of as far as the cemeteries in town. But I poked around, Steamboat, Hayden, Oak Creek, and then I did go up to Hans Peak Village and explored those kind of right off the bat when I came here, the first summer or two that I was here. And those are super interesting, especially the differences in all of those cemeteries, especially if you guys have not been up to the Hans Peak Cemetery or the Clark Cemetery. It's a very different feel than it is in Steamboat and Hayden and Oak Creek, just very different environments for sure. And in the Hans Peak Village Cemetery, actually, this is also kind of one of those stories that people think I'm kind of strange for, but I work with kids, and I've done summer camps before, and we've gone up to Hans Peak Village and did some crayon etchings on the cemetery, on the gravestones up there, and the kids were definitely pretty weirded out when I said that we were going to go explore a cemetery for one of our projects, but they ended up having a really great time, and they saw some really cool designs, and gravestones are beautiful and have lots of really cool information and decorations and flower etchings, a lot of them found, that kind of thing. So it was a really cool experience for them. I've also done a scavenger hunt in the Steamboat Springs Cemetery with a group of kids. And again, they also thought that was pretty strange and didn't really want to do it at first, but we went around looking for, of course, famous Olympians, the founders of the town, and then also some weirder stories. I don't have them included in here, but how many of you guys have heard about William Harvey in the Steamboat Cemetery? Does that name sound familiar to anyone? He's a person, if you go to the cemetery and you find his grave, I think the number is that he killed 56 bears in Routt County, and that's on his gravestone. So, fun fact, if you ever go up there, that was one that I took the kids to, and they had to go find, what was his claim to fame, was that he killed 56 bears in Routt County. So, that was a fun one. So yeah, I did explore some of those major cemeteries first and found a lot of those cool stories, and I'm not totally sure how it happened that I wanted to expand into more rural ones. But obviously, this is a very different area than where I grew up in semi-suburban Michigan. So I wanted to explore some of the different places that I wouldn't have been able to see in Michigan. And I kind of just did some rabbit hole research on the internet. Again, I don't really know how it happened, just kind of tumbled down there and found some names and GPS coordinates and vague locations of where these cemeteries were in Routt County, some really small ones. So I knew I wanted to go find those eventually and just kind of see what else I could find beyond the really well-marked and well-researched grave sites. And I should specify, I'm using the word grave site now. When I say cemeteries, I do specifically mean grave sites because they're not exactly what you would picture as cemeteries, a lot of these places. They are just sites that may or may not still have grave significance, because some of those people who were buried there may not be anymore. They might not be marked, things have changed. Like I said, it's very different than just a regular sort of family plot in Michigan that I'm used to, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But a lot of these places I have gone, I know that, based on my research, I know that there's stuff there's somebody who was buried there at one point, or somewhere in that vicinity, but they might not be there anymore. So I might have gone to exploring these places, and there's nothing actually to see there, but I can just I understand that there's just like that, I don't want to say an aura almost, but kind of, it's a significance that I feel of someone was buried here at some point during history, and they might not be there anymore, they might still be, I don't know, but this is a significant place for that family and that history. So it's just enough for me to be able to explore that area and to use my imagination and speculate like who was buried here and why, and what was their life like when they lived here. And that's the cool thing about history, is the speculation about who these people were. We do have some facts about some of these people that I'm going to talk about, but of course I don't know much about their lives beyond what is reported in the newspapers. So that's the fun thing about being able to sort of just think beyond that and extrapolate what maybe was society like and what was Routt County like at this time, what were things like for these people who lived and died here. So all that sort of background information aside, I'm going to get talking about some of the cemeteries and grave sites here in Routt County. And this really started in full force for me 2 summers ago, not the summer but the previous one, with a place called the Dead Mexican Park Cemetery. And with a name like that, you already know there's going to be a cool story behind it. So let's jump right into it. So this is a picture of the Dead Mexican Park Cemetery. And this is exactly what I mean when I say that this doesn't look like a cemetery. You wouldn't see this and think that yes, there's people buried there. And there are. And this is the story of how it all started, especially me getting involved with the museum. So again, 2 summers ago, I had vaguely heard about the Dead Mexican Park Cemetery, and I wanted to go and try to find it. So I drove up to north of Hans Peak, and I have a Ford Focus that does not belong to any of those roads over there at all. So I had to park a little ways down and then walk a little distance to go try to find it. But you can see this forest road on the left here, and it curves off to the left and goes for a long way. If you guys have explored up there, you know that the roads are very just circuitous and go everywhere all at once. So I was wandering around, and I was, like I said, I was looking for something that I'd seen in Michigan. They're very, a lot of times there are graveyards next to churches, for instance, and those are very well marked, fenced in, very well kept. I also recently went to the East Coast for the first time and went to a couple cemeteries there. And if you guys have from the East Coast or been there, you know that that's also very packed, very well marked, very crowded. It's just a very different environment than, again, what I was expecting from a cemetery out here. So you can see in the background of this picture there's a bunch of pine trees in the forest up there. And I was definitely going into my exploration this day looking for something that was like at least a family plot, something that was small, maybe a fence like this, but definitely some actual grave markers of some sort. And when I didn't find that, I was disappointed, but I kind of thought, well, it's rural, it's old, maybe something happened, it's not here anymore, whatever. And I kind of just thought that my cemetery adventure that day was a bust. So I came back into town. And I remember that it was funny because it was a Friday at 4:15 p.m. when I came back into town. That's when everybody loves getting those end of work week phone calls, I'm sure. But I had looked for a little bit online, and then when I didn't find very much, I called up the Troy Pioneers Museum, and was very fortunate, it was very serendipitous, that Katie Adams, the curator, happened to answer the phone that day, and she had actually been gathering information about the Dead Mexican Park Cemetery recently for somebody else. And would I like to come in the next morning and read all about it? So of course I did. At 4:15 on a Friday, what luck I had with her. So I went in the next day, and spent an hour or two just going over these old documents. A lot of them were just old Forest Service records. Some records from books, some arrest records, and crime reports from the story that I'm about to share with you. So that's really how this all started, because I read this and was absolutely fascinated, and you'll see why. Again, it's very gnarly at this point. So here is an article from the Routt County Sentinel, published on August 27th, 1915, and we're just going to jump right into the violence, so hope you're ready. So this one, 2 Mexican sheep herders killed in cold blood by fellow employee. Here's the story on that. Jose Velarde, entrusted with companion's paycheck, squanders the proceeds and seeks to cover the theft by murder. Body of one victim is partially cremated by burning in his bed. What is undoubtedly the most cold-blooded murder that has ever taken place in Routt County occurred at an early hour Tuesday morning at one of the sheep camps of the Carbon County Sheep and Cattle Company at Red Park, 6 or 7 miles northeast of Columbine, when Jose Velarde, a Mexican, deliberately shot and killed 2 other Mexicans, Cirillo Velasquez and Marquez Quita, the herders at the camp where he himself was employed as camp mover. Velarde is now in the county jail, having been captured while he was awaiting a chance to kill 2 other men before fleeing from the country. The killing is the outcome of a previous crime committed by Velarde some 6 weeks ago, when he was entrusted by Velasquez with a paycheck, which Velarde took to Columbine to cash for Velasquez, but which he proceeded to spend for liquor before returning to the camp. Velasquez had been insistent that his money should be restored to him, and on Monday had threatened Velarde with prosecution, whereupon Velarde went again to Columbine and procured a .25-35 Winchester rifle with which he evidently intended to silence his accuser. So this story is already very interesting. I'm glad I'm getting a few laughs of just how outrageous this story is already. To note just something about this, and again with all the articles I'm going to share, there are a lot of discrepancies about the names and places and just sort of details like that. Again, it's kind of just it's just because of the time that the newspaper was written. They weren't necessarily all accurate with names and dates and places and that kind of thing. So there are a couple of different versions for how that this gravesite got its name, but this is one of the most prominent stories and definitely one of my favorite ones and one of the most sensationalized one. So a little bit more information about what happened. So again, this kind of gives the background of it, but Jose, or Joe Velarde, had been herding sheep north of Hunts Peak, and then the discrepancies are kind of like the ones I'm about to share with you. So he either stole money from his fellow sheep herders or borrowed it under false pretenses. And at some point he went to Columbine, and then, as it mentions in this article, he either wasted it on liquor or he gambled it away in a poker game. And then he came back empty-handed and decided to murder his colleagues rather than fess up and pay it back. So he shot one of the men point blank and then dragged him while he was in his bed into the campfire. And the other man tried to crawl away and escape, but Velarde then went and tracked him down and shot him too. And then Velarde then fled north to the Elkhorn mine, and he was captured a few days later and held in the Steamboat Springs jail. I don't know a whole lot more about the 2 men who were murdered, and as I said, even their names are different in some of the articles you might find about them. There's just so many discrepancies about that. But there's a little bit more about the gravesite in particular that I can share with you in a different article to follow up on that one. So pleads guilty of murder at hearing. Jose Velarde, again with the name changes, who is in jail at Steamboat Springs, charged with the murder of Cirillo Velasquez and Marquez Quita, was given a preliminary hearing before Justice of Peace J.R. Caron at Columbine, at which he pleaded guilty and was bound over to the district court for trial, being held without bail. Coroner Bashor held an inquest over the bodies of the 2 dead men, and the verdict of the jury was that they had come to their death by shooting at the hands of Jose Velarde and recommended that he be dealt with according to law. The 2 victims of the murderer were buried side by side at the camp where they were killed, the graves being marked by boards bearing their name. So from that last paragraph, you can see, it turns out that I actually was in the right spot when I went exploring up there. I'm going to go back to that picture for a second. So all you can see in this picture is just that fenced-in 10 by 10 plot where they either were killed in that specific spot or they definitely were buried there somewhere close to where they were killed. And unsurprisingly, as you can see from this picture, the boards marking their names are no longer there since they were put there in 1915. It would be a miracle if they had survived. So all that remains now is this 10 by 10 area, which was put up in 1951. And there used to be a marker, a sign marking the area. You can kind of see the post for it on the left there in front of that tree, but that was also stolen decades ago as well. And what was interesting to me, looking at this picture, and then when I did research when I was at the Charter Pioneers Museum that day, in the file that they had given me, is they had a picture of the site from 1994, And just the difference of what this looks like from this picture in 2021 from 1994 was incredibly different. This big tree on the left has also since fallen down. It's been died and then it was cut down and fell over. But the ones from 1994, those big pine trees, weren't there. They were obviously there, but much smaller. And the fence was at least in a little bit better condition. So that was only 30 years ago. And thinking about the difference between 1915 and 2023, and just what that site is going to look like in another year from now, or 30 or 100 years, it's particularly fascinating to me. So I'm just curious, yeah, going back there, if people visit it, what's it going to look like? Despite not really looking like a cemetery, not looking like a grave site. Let me go back to this one. Okay, and then to wrap up this story, so a little bit of dark, ironic, poetic justice in this story. I guess is the best way that I can put that, tactfully at this point. Again, there's some discrepancies and some differences in historical records here, but what happened to Velarde, he was imprisoned at the Canyon City Penitentiary. He was sentenced to 12 years for the murders, but released after 6. And then he became a sheep herder for the warden, whose name was Tom Tynan, who had a sheep herd in and around Oak Creek. So Velarde was in the flat tops one night, and there's a couple stories, he either got too drunk, had an epileptic fit, or got struck by lightning. And in all of those stories, he fell into his fire and burned to death. So there's the poetic justice there. And in the flat tops, if you've ever heard of Dead Mexican Gulch, that is one of the proposed stories for why that area got its name. So a lot of colorful history. And I have not been to that place in particular, but I'm very intrigued to try to go there. It's pretty remote, but just knowing the connection of all of this is pretty interesting to me. Again, with just the context and history of everything that happened with society, and there were a lot of sheep herders who were in similar situations, pretty Wild West violent situations. So just a little first taste of some of the cemetery exploration that I've done there. When I go wandering in cemeteries, I get asked a lot, what do I look for? I don't know if any of you guys have wandered around cemeteries before. I highly recommend it, even if you're not looking for anything. They're just very relaxing places to be, and you can just kind of see names and look for things. It's a lot of fun. So when I'm wandering around cemeteries, there isn't really a clear answer to that question of what I look for. It kind of just depends on what my mood is, or maybe I am looking for something in particular, or just wandering and seeing what seems beautiful to me that day or anything. There's just a whole myriad of factors in it. But I can narrow down a few things that I do tend to notice as I'm wandering around, and again, it just varies depending on what strikes my eye that day. So I want to point out one set of gravestones to you. Hopefully you guys can see that okay. So I want to ask you guys just a little brief audience participation. What stands out to you in these gravestones? Why would I have stopped to look at these in particular? What are your thoughts?
They died the same year.
They died the same year. Yeah, so looking at these gravestones, you can see that there are 4 people, and they all died in 1933. So if I'm walking through a cemetery and I see that, I've done it before, literally, well, I'll stop and do a double take and go back and be like, wait a minute, that's odd. So you can kind of infer at least a couple things about this group of people. One, they were probably family members because of their last name. And then based on the birth years, you can probably figure out which ones were the parents over here on the left and which ones were the children, or whatever their relationship was, something similar along those lines. The younger ones over on the left, or on the right. And based on the year, they probably died from either some illness that happened the same year or an accident that took their lives in the same time. And when I did a little bit of research on them, that is exactly what I found out. So this one is 4 killed in automobile accident on Williams Fork. I believe this one was from 1933. So Mr. and Mrs. Albert Kime, Betty Kime, age 11, and Roy Kime, age 6, of Williams Fork, were instantly killed, and Mrs. Marvel Carey of McGregor was injured Tuesday afternoon when the Kime automobile went off the road about 7 miles from the Willow Creek store on the Williams Fork Road near the Creamer Place. The car plunged down a 75-foot bank, overturned, and landed on its wheels, then apparently backed on a stretch of level ground, dropped 40 feet into the river below, landing on its side in about 3 feet of water. Relatives in the car ahead saw part of the accident and went to the telephone for help. Soon a number of Williams Fork and Hayden people were on the scene. The bodies of Mr. and Mrs. Kime were found in the wreckage. The 2 children had been thrown from the car. The body of Betty was found at 7 o'clock that evening, and the body of Roy the next morning, both about 1.5 miles from the wrecked car. Alice Kime, age 14, another daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Kime, was not injured. So more on this family. This is a particularly tragic one given the context of what they were doing. This actually was a 4th of July picnic with another family that they had been on. And at some point on the way home, the stories that I saw were either the steering gear of the car failed to work, or this is again kind of a comical one, but the sun was too much in Albert Kime's eyes and he lost control of the car, and then somehow this happened and he went careening down a cliff. And this one is particularly interesting to me because it was written in 1933, so it's the lens of someone driving in 1933. And cars, of course, had been around at that point, they weren't brand new, but it's just an interesting perspective that the way that it was written about cars then would be very different than how car crashes are written about today in the newspaper, as well as how they describe the location of where this happened. It shows a lot about the way people lived in very close proximity to each other, because they talk about 7 miles from the Willow Creek store near the Creamer place. You have to know where those places are to know where he's talking about, as opposed to the intersection of 3rd and Lincoln or whatever today. It's a very different way of describing it. So that is one thing that I look for as far as interesting dates that I see on gravestones. Another thing that I look for is unique or interesting names that we don't often hear much anymore, like this one. This is Eva Styleson. He was a longtime rancher in the Hayden area. Pretty well respected in the community. And this is another one of those very stereotypical Wild West stories I'm about to share. This one is quite literal, this town's not big enough for the two of us kind of story. So a little bit of background before I get into the articles. So he got into a dispute with a neighbor over water rights. So Donaldson was in possession of some land that had a water source, and his neighbor, whose name was Sim Tipton, which I always struggle to say, Sim Tipton had a deed that allowed him to use only the wastewater from Donaldson's property, which of course was not good enough for him, and things escalated, of course, from there. So in this one, Eve Donaldson is murdered, shot to death by Sim Tipton, a neighboring ranchman. Terrible tragedy at Hayden last Friday, the culmination of trouble over ditch and water rights. Eva Styleson, one of the old-timers of the county and a well-known ranchman and stockman, was shot and instantly killed at his ranch near Hayden last Friday afternoon by Sim Tipton, a neighbor. Tipton immediately gave himself up, and his preliminary trial is being held today at Hayden. The greatest excitement followed the murder, for it was a shock to the entire county, but particularly so to the people of the Hayden Valley, where Mr. Donaldson has lived the greater portion of his life and where he numbered everybody as his friend. So this part, before I read the second part of it, tells you a little bit about just how well respected and well liked he was in the community. And then later on in the article, according to Hoberg's testimony, Tipton asked in a rather excited and angry way something about the water that Donaldson was using, and the latter started to explain when Tipton unloosed his rifle and covered Donaldson, at the same time saying, "Shut up or I will shoot you." Donaldson was a man of great courage, and he straightened up and exclaimed, "Well, blaze away." So that is a great glimpse of both how Donaldson was portrayed in these newspaper accounts. He clearly was very well respected in the community. And then again, those last 3 words, just how differently newspapers were written. You would never see that in an article about any sort of gun violence today, of course, but this is something that's just very interesting about those old-timey newspapers and the way that they're written. This one was back in July of 1908, so more than 100 years ago. Another one, factors of things I look for when I'm exploring cemeteries, is the materials that graves are made out of. And again, this is where I say I'm definitely not an expert about why gravestones are carved into what they are, the substances they're built into. A lot of it has to do with just what's available, what will survive the weather, depending on the locations where they're all at. Like I mentioned, I went to the East Coast recently, and I saw some really cool slate gravestones that were kind of layered the way that slate is, and I had never seen that before, and it was just interesting thinking about, again, I don't know why, but what would be the reasons for using that primarily in a cemetery as opposed to other sort of substances to build gravestones out of that would last, or they might not last, as you'll see this next one here. So I'm not an expert on why people use certain types of gravestones, but I do find them interesting that there's a huge variety in all the different cemeteries that I've been to. So this next one was pretty interesting to me. This is up in the Hanspeak Village Cemetery, George Washington Cross. This headstone is made entirely out of wood, and it's the first like this that I've ever seen. I've seen plenty of wooden crosses or just temporary wooden markers, that kind of thing, but I've never seen a full grave. And of course that's just not going to last as long as some of the other ones that are made out of different and stronger materials. And this is an interesting story too. It tells a lot about who George Washington Cross was and sort of what he did for his profession. So there's a couple articles I want to read about him. And these are both from October 1907. here. So this first one on the left, Sam Stevens and J.W. Critchfield brought George Cross down from Hans Peak Saturday, the latter suffering from a severe attack of pneumonia contracted about the time he was able to leave his bed, to which he was confined by a broken hip caused by the collapse of the roof of the Larson sawmill some months ago. The case was considered a serious one by Dr. Jefferson, in whose care Cross was placed for treatment, and but little hope was entertained for his recovery. In spite of the care given him, Cross died a few minutes after 9 o'clock Monday morning. Cross was occupying a room in the Love Apartments in the Sturdivant home. The funeral was held yesterday at Hans Peak. And then a little more background on what happened there. The article on the right. Hans Peak mourns the death of George W. Cross, a respected citizen of that town. Mr. Cross was brought to Steamboat last Saturday by Sam Stevens and J.W. Critchfield in a very serious condition from pneumonia, which was contracted but recently. He was placed under the care of Dr. Jefferson and on Sunday appeared in a much improved condition with strong hopes of recovery, but during Sunday night he grew worse and passed away Monday morning at 9 o'clock. The remains were interred in the burial grounds at Hans Peak on Wednesday afternoon, the entire town and surrounding country turning out to pay their last tribute to their friend. So to explain this a little bit more too, he had been in a sawmill accident of some sort during the summer of 1907, and he had been confined in his bed with a broken hip for some weeks for a while after that point. And then again, it's a sort of that dark comic irony here is that when he finally began to heal from that, that's when he contracted pneumonia, which grew more severe until he finally died from it in October. So again, this is an interesting one to me because it tells you a lot about the life that he lived and the occupations that were around here. They were very dangerous, mining and sawmills and stuff like that. That was very, common for this area in this time. And it tells you a lot about the injuries and illnesses they would have gotten from these professions. And I like this one too, and again, going back to the wooden gravestone of this one, because it sounds like from these articles that George Cross was very well liked and well cared for, and people were really mourning his death when he died. So what might have been the reason he didn't get a better gravestone that would have lasted longer? And I don't know the answer to that. Something obviously would have happened that prevented that from having a longer lasting gravestone, but again, that's a story that you can kind of extrapolate and say, I don't know what his family life was like. He maybe didn't have anyone here to pay for it, something like that. But he clearly was well liked enough by the community that it wouldn't have been because he, was nobody or didn't have any family and friends here. Probably not. But again, we don't know for sure. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit here, and we're going to get into the rest of this presentation is a lot about one of my favorite parts of cemeteries that I try to go to, but especially in the Steamboat Springs Cemetery, which is the Potter's Field section, sometimes referred to as having the paupers' graves in it. And I don't know if anyone's been up to the one in the Steamboat Springs Cemetery, but this is a picture of it right here. So this is in the lower left section as you're coming up the hill into the cemetery. Going down the hill off the road there is the Potter's Field section. And this is a place where unknown people were buried, indigent people were buried, kind of shameful professions were buried there, people who didn't have any family or money, all those things that I just talked about for George Cross. Somebody at least could pay for a wooden gravestone for him, but a lot of people who were buried anywhere in the county, but especially in this section who were dealt with by the city or the county, they were buried in the Potter's Field in the Steamboat Springs Cemetery. So as you can see, this is taken from this past summer, and there are wooden crosses to mark some of the graves, but they're unlabeled at this point. They've all been rubbed off if they were ever labeled, and the whole area is just overgrown and unkempt and unmarked, and that's honestly a big reason why I love it there, because there's a lot that we don't know about it. There's actually only 3 gravestones in that area that are still marked, and the rest are just crosses or nothing at all, and there's dozens of people that either were or still are buried there, and again, we don't know what happened. We don't know if they were dug up and moved. We don't know any of that stuff other than at some point there are names of people who were buried there. And I did come across a list of names compiled by Roger and Joyce Cusick of the National Association for Cemetery Preservation. They compiled a huge list of people who were buried all over the county, but especially they have a list of names who were buried here. So I was able to do quite a bit of research on digging into more of the people who were buried here, but we don't know more about at this point. So the people that I'm going to talk about in the rest of this presentation were buried there at one point, and like I said, we just don't know what happened to them, and their stories remain unknown. And one of the stories I'm going to talk about of a woman in particular who was buried here is probably my favorite story of the Routt County cemetery history, maybe tied for the Dead Mexican Park one as well. It's a very interesting and another very violent story. Before I get into that though, I do just want to mention a lot of the people who were buried here we do know were prostitutes. I don't know if you guys are aware, but the Brooklyn neighborhood just down the street used to be the red light district of Steamboat, which I find a particularly interesting history. So book recommendation for you guys is The Yampa Valley Sin Circuit by Laurel Watson. If you guys have not read that, the museum has it and it's super interesting. So I read that book and I learned a lot about just the red light districts and bootlegging and all the nefarious things that happen across the river from Steamboat proper. And a lot of those people who were prostitutes were at one point again buried in this section of the Potter's Field in the cemetery. And I just want to quote one quick section from that book for you guys. So she says, Laura Watson in the book says, when a prostitute died, she was placed in the lower section of the cemetery, commonly referred to as the Potter's Field, where those who were destitute or vagrant were buried, with just a wooden cross, if any, to mark her place. So, like I mentioned, we have no idea what happened to them. And the lives of those women, and all women, to be honest, tell a very different story of Steamboat than what you may have heard in schools or just in history books in general. It's a very different story, and I wish that there was more information about those women in particular. And that's something that I may do hopefully in a future presentation or future research. We'll see. But it was because of just those sort of mundane stories. Obviously not just prostitutes, but any women who were buried without knowing their names. It was those mundane stories of just domestic life and daily life that we don't really hear about, and those are what are particularly interesting to me. We don't hear about those in favor of the more, like I mentioned with the scavenger hunt that I did, we hear more about the famous Olympians, we hear more about people who founded the county, founded the city, things like that. And we don't hear about those people who maybe lived a more boring and average life, but they still lived importantly, and now we can hear about them through their deaths at least. So, just a little disclaimer there, this woman that I'm about to talk about, she wasn't a prostitute, but she was one of those women who just had really terrible luck, and she was just an average woman in a very kind of lawless place, and things didn't go very well for her in that sense either. So all of those factors of just being a woman and being where she lived, and people not really knowing who she was until I delved really deep into the story and got obsessed with it, that I just need to share with you guys. But that's why her story is one of my favorites. So again, this is one of those very graphic newspaper articles, and this is about a murder that took place in 1922. Oh, sorry, her name is Milica Boric, I forgot to mention that part. That's her gravestone right there in the corner of the Potter's Field section. Okay, so here's the story. Cuts wife throat with pocket knife. Joe Kiesel died at the Oak Creek Hospital Friday morning of the wounds inflicted by Dan Boric, making the second death in the tragedy. After stabbing her in a dozen places with a pocket knife, Dan Boric cut the throat of his wife, Milica Boric, Tuesday afternoon. He also severely wounded Joe Kiesel, cutting a 5-inch slash in his abdomen. Boric is in the county jail at Steamboat. District Attorney Wiley has filed a direct information against him, and he will be tried at the term of court, which begins a week from Monday. Coroner Bashor was here and held an inquest over the body of the dead woman, the jury finding a verdict in accordance with the above facts. Family troubles were the cause of the murder. Boric was last week tried for beating up his wife by Justice of the Peace Samuel Bell, who sentenced him to 3 months in the county jail. This sentence was remitted upon Boric's promise to behave. Mrs. Boric had filed an action for divorce. And I'm glad you guys are laughing, because the idea that family troubles were the cause of the murder and that he was remitted for good behavior, or maybe it was all because he had an extremely violent and jealous reaction to a pretty harmless thing, which is that Milica had money, and he didn't like that very much. So Milica had about $900 saved, which is about $15,000 today. And at the time of her death, she was interested in having her own finances because she wanted a divorce, and she wanted to potentially purchase a cow for herself from her neighbor. And then her drunk, abusive husband found out, wanted to borrow the money, and he became jealous and had delusions of infidelity with the neighbor for her. And then this is how that situation escalated. And there's another article I want to share with you guys about that, with how this kind of followed up. Which is that Dan Boric will suffer death on the gallows. An Oak Creek miner who murdered wife and friend to pay extreme penalty by verdict of jury. If the sentence of the court and jury is carried out, Dan Boric of Oak Creek will be the first man from Routt County to suffer the death penalty. After being out from 3 o'clock Friday afternoon until 1:30 Saturday morning, the jury brought in a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree and fixed the penalty at death. The murder, committed on March 21st, was one of the most terrible in the history of the county. Boric, who is a Serbian coal miner and was employed by the Victor American mine at Oak Creek, had previously had trouble with his wife, and she had filed an action for divorce. On this day, he testified that coming out of the mine, he drank a quantity of liquor. He claimed to have been in a condition where he did not know what had occurred, and that everything was hazy until he found himself in the county jail at Steamboat. This evidence was contradicted by Frank Watt, who arrested him and talked with him that day and the next. He said Boric asked if Kiesel was dead and expressed satisfaction at his deed, that he ate heartily and was in other ways of a normal condition of mind. The strongest testimony against Borge was given by his daughter Mary, 7 years old, and who proved to be a remarkable witness. She said she, her mother, and Kiesel were going down the road toward Kiesel's place to look at a cow which her mother contemplated purchasing. Her father overtook them and began slashing at Mrs. Borge with a knife. Kiesel interfered and received a cut in the abdomen which almost disemboweled him. Mrs. Borge ran down a bank and was hidden by a Japanese woman who lived there, but Borge crawled through a window to continue the attack. Mrs. Borge ran out of the house and toward the creek, her husband following her and stabbing her in the back. He overtook her and cut her throat from ear to ear. He then washed his hands in the creek and remained hidden in the willows until arrested. Yeah, pretty brutal. I guess in good news, I'm not sure. Dan Borge, like that article just mentioned with the headline there, he was the very first person ever from Routt County to be executed by the state on August 18th, 1922. Their 2 children, Mike and Mary, they went into state custody immediately after the killings, and during that time, Mike was 17 and working at one of the mines in Mount Harris, and Mary was 7. They both received money from their mother's life insurance policy, about $1,800 back then, which is about $32,000 today, which went toward Mary's education at the Mount Scholastica Academy. And other than that, I've tried to look more into the children to see what happened to them after that horrifically traumatic experience when they were both kids, but haven't really been able to find much more beyond their schooling when Mary was 7 and Mike was 17. So, want to pause there. I realize how dark this all sounds and how morbid this all is. And like I said, unsurprisingly, I can only share the articles about their deaths because that was what was reported. It was so sensationalized and such a big news back then, rather than their lives, because of the things I mentioned, that their deaths were shocking and their lives were probably pretty boring up to that point. All those daily routines that I mentioned, but like I said, this is what keeps things rolling and keeps things just being those mundane daily routines that we don't really hear a lot about anymore. A couple of the articles I am going to share do give you a little glimpse of daily lives, which is why I want to share them with you. And again, mention that this is how newspapers were written back then. You could go into any newspaper. Have you guys seen pictures of old newspapers that have just tons of tiny text on the front page? There's no pictures, it's just little paragraph to little paragraph. So a lot of those were just really, honestly, boring articles about who was doing what, and who was visiting whose neighbor, and who had potatoes to sell, and who had whatever cows on their property, and stuff like that. So luckily, by finding these old stories, yes, a lot of them are very violent and about death, but some of them do tell you a little bit about the people's lives before they died. So I do have a couple, hopefully a little bit more uplifting stories about some of the deaths than the ones that we just heard. So the rest of these, like I mentioned, are more people who were at one point buried in the potter's field, and we can tell a little bit more about their lives just than that their names were forgotten when they were buried. So the next one is a man called Sam Moore. So again, on the left is the shocking article about how he died. So he died after being crushed in a mine shaft in 1923, which again brings to mind the danger of the work that was being done 100 years ago. But then on the right is something more interesting and provides a glimpse more about his life before his death. This is from 1920, when Sam Moore was arrested for a bootlegging operation, which was right at the beginning of Prohibition. He was making whiskey in his kitchen and his attic, and he was fined $200, which is about $3,000 today for doing so. And the quote that I like from this article here is that he says, Moore claims that he was manufacturing the whiskey for the relief of his wife who suffers from asthma. And I've said this before, that I don't drink whiskey, but someone let me know if that actually works for asthma. So again, that's just kind of a context for that was Prohibition. That was what was going on at the time, and they got in trouble for bootlegging whiskey in the kitchen. And then another one, this is another kind of tragic story, but another interesting one about a teenager who died. This is about Pearl Roberts. Bandit killed in an attempt to burglarize store. Pearl Roberts escaped from industrial school, shot to death by Walter Burkett at Hayden early Monday morning. Pearl Roberts, 16, fleeing from the state industrial school where he was a federal prisoner, is dead at Hayden, where he was shot about 4 o'clock Monday morning by Walter Burkett as Roberts and a companion, William Wall, were burglarizing the J.I. Burkett store. Roberts and Wall were Trudy's students, I guess, at the State Industrial School and escaped early Saturday morning. They had been sent to the boiler room with baskets of waste paper for burning, and instead of returning, ran toward Lookout Mountain. On the mountain, they stole a Ford sedan and made their getaway. They came through Middle Park and over the Rabbit Ears Road and pilfered several things on the way. They stole gasoline from at least one car that was by the side of the road on Rabbit Ears Pass. Apparently, they forgot to steal any oil, and when they got to Wolf Creek near Mount Harris, the bearings of the automobile burned out and they abandoned the car there. They walked to Mount Harris, and it is said tried to steal another automobile, Failing in this, they walked to Hayden and spotted another automobile and made arrangements to burglarize the Burkett store. And I do have one more article on the next slide about how that went and the person who was there to stop them from doing it. But before I read that one as well, one thing that I do appreciate, I couldn't find the article when I was trying to find it again for this talk, but I had also read that the friend, William Wall, mentioned here. So he survived. Pearl got shot fatally and then died right there when it happened. But the part of humanity that I really liked about this story is that William Wall pulled Pearl outside the store and sort of like cradled him and comforted him while he was bleeding out on the sidewalk after this robbery attempt. So yes, it was a horrible situation. These kids were teenagers who made some pretty terrible decisions, but that last little aspect of humanity that he still was trying to comfort his friend in his last dying moments was very touching to me. And then a little bit more, again, on this story and then what happened with Walter Burkett, who is the son of the store owner. One boy killed, another captured while attempting to rob Hayden's store. And just this little blurry section down below says, an attempted robbery of the Hayden Club store was prevented early Monday morning by Walter Burkett, son of the proprietor, who was sleeping in one of the back rooms. Walter went into the main part of the store when he heard someone entering the store and shot when the robbers refused to throw up their hands. Pearl Roberts, a 16-year-old boy who recently escaped from the state industrial school at Golden, was killed, and his associate William Wall, another escaped inmate of the school, was caught before he could make his escape in their automobile. He is now lodged in the county jail. The jury, called by Coroner Heyer, after hearing the evidence, which was clear and undisputed, exonerated Walter Burkett for the killing. So again, that was just a couple of teenagers that we heard about that made some really bad choices, but it's interesting that we do know what their, I guess, sort of their thought process was and what they wanted to achieve by just stealing a bunch of cars and trying to make their getaway somewhere. The next story I have is another little bit of a mystery, but this one was at least solved fairly quickly. So here's what the initial article says about the remains of a prospector found on Sand Mountain, and this is from 1935. Coroner A.W. Heyer was called to Slater Wednesday to investigate the skeleton of a man found on the west side of Sand Mountain on Tuesday by Vicente Pino, Mexican sheepherder for E.O. Miller. Under-Sheriff William Caulfield accompanied Mr. Heyer to the place where the bones were found. Underbrush and timber are so heavy in the vicinity that the last 3 miles of the trip were made on horseback. The bones were brought to Steamboat Springs. The supposition is that the skeleton is that of an aged prospector who was grove-staked by E.W. Leggett of Baggs, Wyoming. The prospector disappeared about 2 years ago, and a lengthy search failed to reveal what had happened to him. The pick and shovel and walking stick were nearby. Mr. Heyer will get into communication with Mr. Leggett to determine whether or not he can identify the skeleton. A letter written by Mr. Leggett was found in a tobacco can near the spot of the discovery. So this one is, like I said, a mystery story. This also has to do a lot with the Wild West aspects of somebody who was out wandering, prospecting, which is a very sort of 100 years ago Wild West thing to do. So before I get into the mystery being solved on the next slide here, so this ended up being a man whose name was Frank Fernald, and he was a prospector in the area who discovered a mine that had a small boom for a while. He went out searching for a lost mine in 1933, and then when this article was written, his bones had been found, so at least they were able to identify him correctly, and they knew who it was. So this article on the left here is about his actual death. Jim Norville was greatly distressed to hear that the skeleton found on Sand Mountain is probably that of Frank Fernald, whom he knew well. At the time of the grand encampment boom, Norville grub-staked Fernald to prospect in the district, and he discovered a mine near the Ferris Haggerty, which had a fine showing. A Denver mining man offered a cash payment of $20,000 for the property just as it stood, but Fernald, as is the way with prospectors, had his sights raised to a high figure, so the deal passed up. The boom collapsed. The longest aerial tram in the country, which carried ore from the Ferris Haggerty to the smelter and encampment, fell into rust and decay. The smelter was dismantled, and there was another ghost town on the map. The Fernald Norville mine was near Copperton, which had ambitions of being a city. And then the article on the right, which is from 3 decades earlier, to the day, actually, tells you a little bit more about Frank Fernald's life, which is kind of amusing, this one, just the second paragraph of that one. There was a shooting affray in Dillon Thursday evening, the 20th, between Frank L. Fernald and Joe Hardenberg. It appears that jealousies over a landlady of a sporting house in Dillon was the cause leading up to the affray. Hardenberg had been threatening Fernald for some time and came to Dillon this evening and found Fernald in the room with the woman and proceeded to batten down the door. When the door opened, Fernald took a shot at him and missed. Hardenberg slammed the door shut, and Fernald took 2 shots at him through the door, one of which took effect at the base of his pelvis. The bullet was removed by the doctor, and so far there have been no serious complications. So again, just one of those funny stories. This is quite a love triangle situation that would have been quite scandalous. This was again back in 1905, so it was something that was a big deal that had to be in the newspapers, in addition to the shooting, but also the story of the love triangle. So it's just interesting about that. And then to end on a, again, slightly, hopefully uplifting note, this last one I want to share is J.S. Blakely, who, compared to the other articles that I've shared with you, lived very much an ordinary life, no real violence or drama in his life. So the one on the article about his death is here on the left, but what I really liked is these two short little snippets on the right. Like I mentioned, people just wrote about anything in the newspaper because there wasn't a lot going on. So I like the idea that they wrote about how he had a farm, a ranch on the Elk River, and that he grew potatoes for the area. And this little second one here eventually refers to him as the Potato Man, which amuses me quite a bit. So just something to end on that, you know, we don't know a lot about these people's lives, but we know enough that J.S. Blakely was the Potato Man for a while in Routt County. So to finish up here, this is a picture from the Elk Mountain Cemetery, which is beautiful. If you guys have ever been up that way, just south of Sleeping Giant. I have been really lucky to explore beautiful areas like this, as I mentioned, and to see some really cool grave sites. And I'm sure that I've missed so many stories that could be super interesting, and I love finding out more about them and I want to know more. But you know, I've overlooked a bunch and they've simply been forgotten in a lot of ways. History just can't keep up with the ones that aren't well documented. And despite our best efforts, despite my best efforts now telling you guys about these really interesting stories to me, there's going to be stories that go untold no matter what happens. And that's okay. I know that I'm speaking at an event sponsored by a history museum, but I don't necessarily think that it's some moral responsibility for all of us right now to be really focused on preserving history as it's happening right now. Because what we're living through, as I keep mentioning, it's just daily, kind of boring, humdrum life. And that's gonna be interesting someday maybe, but right now we're just living it, right? All those things I talked about, especially with the women that I want to know more about, we don't know much about them, but yeah, their lives were interesting 100, 150 years ago, whenever it was. And the same thing happens for us right now. The example that I was going to mention is that I keep a journal, and I don't do the best job of writing in it a whole lot, but sometimes it's really dull even to me, and it's my own life. That's probably why it's so dull. But someday, those are the things that historians are really going to value and love, and they're going to want to know more about just the daily things that I'm thinking about and going through. And that's what happens with these stories that we don't know about, and we only have heard about their deaths because we don't know anything about their lives. So there's that aspect of history which I find super interesting, being able to uncover those bits of history that we otherwise wouldn't be able to without going back in history through newspapers or whatever it is that we're able to find. And then also thinking about gravestones, for me, personally, I don't want to be buried. I don't want a gravestone, so you're not going to find someone out there poking around for my gravestone in 100 and 200 years. So again, the fact that these people lived and died in relative obscurity is also what fascinates me, because they do have some sort of record out there that we can look up and we can go visit and search and pay respects to. And that is also what increases the intrigue for me, knowing that yes, they kind of lived in the time of historical anonymity, but we're able to look back on history and learn from them now, which I find super interesting. And like I said, we're all here just living our own average lives, and you don't know if you're gonna have a legacy or not, but like, yeah, someone might go searching for you someday, and that's pretty cool. I got to do that with a lot of people from 100 years ago, and I think that's super cool. And one of my favorite stories to end on, along those same lines, is something that I found when I was exploring last summer, which I thought was just really, really cool in addition to the actual gravestone. So I was out searching for a couple of specific sites, and I ended up not being able to find those sites, but instead, I found 2 rolls of film negatives in the dirt. And they were all cracked and grainy and faded away. And I looked more closely, and some of them had a couple of images on them. And then one of them, toward the end of the roll, was this one, which you can clearly tell has a human figure in it. And I have no idea when this picture is from, what year it was. I did try to research what type of film it was, and it didn't go very well. But you can clearly tell there's a person there, and at some point in time, someone valued this moment enough to take a picture of it, and then I got to see it however many years later. So it depicts a regular human being just like us living their lives that someone chose to document. And like I said, I got to see that later. I have no idea what the context is, but it's something almost romantic about being able to see that and to honor that and to be curious about it. And I'm never gonna know who that person was or what the context was for this picture, but I think it's enough just realizing that this was a person in history and that someone did want to preserve it, and then we can do that at the very least. So all this is to say, what remains of people is just what we have of them in history, and it tells us about humans and humanity as a whole, and whatever messages come to us in whatever ways from the past. Thank you, that's all I have.